Hi, everyone. My name is Melina Melgarejo, and I'm a research scientist in the special education department at San Diego State. I also lecture in the special education department, and I'm also part of the research team for the California Autism Professional Training and Information Network, which is an interagency network of providers from SELPAs, from regional centers and universities and family resource centers across the state of California with the goal of scaling up the use of evidence-based practices. And I'm primarily interested in investigating disparities in autism services and using implementation science methods. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I echo that as well. My name is Janice Chan. I am a board certified behavior analyst, and I am also a lecturer at San Diego State in the special education department. Melina and I teach together a class called Issues in Autism. I've had about a year of working with the Autism Center with Vinton at the Autism Center. So that's been really fun. And I also work on a couple of research projects. So most of them are also utilizing implementation science in order to train providers how to use evidence-based practices, specifically naturalistic interventions for individuals with autism. And I'm also currently working on a study that is teaching mid-level leaders at various organizations how to provide leadership that promotes the use of evidence-based practices in their organizations. I'm excited to share with you today about evidence-based practices.
Yes. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now. And everyone can see it? The screen? Great. All right. So as Janice mentioned, today we're going to be talking about how to identify and select evidence-based practices for autism spectrum disorder. And our learning objectives for this webinar are to first define what an evidence-based practice for autism is, identify the different scientific reviews on evidence-based practices, identify how to choose an evidence-based practice, and then learn about some online resources to learn more about evidence-based practices, and also about some local organizations that offer free or reduced cost access to evidence-based practices. And like Vinton mentioned, towards the middle, we'll have some time for questions, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions as well. So before we start talking about evidence-based practices, we like to start off by taking a step back first and then really asking ourselves how many results you think you get if you happen to do a Google search for autism treatment. And so if you did happen to do this, we did this on November 24th, so a week ago, it results in over 200 million results for autism treatment. And so we know that there are not over 200 million evidence-based practices for autism. And so we know that this is inclusive of many practices that people might claim are effective for autism, but that are not. And so it can be overwhelming, both for parents and practitioners or providers, searching for an effective practice for their child or student. And additionally, autism treatments are very broad and are really more diverse than for any other disability. And treatment claims, they range from everything from improving a specific behavior or skill, all the way to promising recovery from the condition. And like I mentioned, unfortunately, many of these treatments really have no scientific evidence to suggest effectiveness. And so when we're talking about an evidence-based practice, what does that actually mean? And really what we want you to know what an evidence-based practice is so that we can be good consumers of these treatments and services. And again, one of the best ways to do that is to really understand what an evidence-based practice is. And so according to the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, evidence-based practices are practices that are focused intervention practices that have evidence of efficacy in promoting positive outcomes for learners with ASD. And so they're generally considered evidence-based practices through really rigorous and objective reviews of scientific studies. But it's really also important to understand that an evidence-based practice isn't just about the practice itself, but really requires the integration of the clinical experience of the practitioner or provider, and also the integration of the student or child's preferences and circumstances. And so all of those components together is really what creates the effective use of an evidence-based practice. So again, before we actually delve into what these evidence-based practices are, why is it important that we use evidence-based practices? Well, for one, here in the US, federal law now requires us to use evidence-based practices both in general and special education. So it's not a suggestion, but a requirement that we should be using these practices in the classroom. And additionally, knowing about these evidence-based practices, I might also use the term EBPs. We use that term sometimes instead so that we don't have to say the whole phrase over and over. Knowing about EBPs allows us to be able to make informed decisions based off an individual child when we select treatments. And lastly, like I mentioned, these practices go through very rigorous reviews of studies that prove their effectiveness in promoting positive outcomes for individuals with autism. So fortunately, we don't have to go through all of these scientific studies on our own to determine which practices have evidence. There are 3 main national centers that have spearheaded scientific reviews of these practices and studies. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these projects. But if you want to learn more about each of these individual centers and reports, then you can go ahead and click on the links. I think Janice might also link those in the chat at one point. So so I encourage you, if you want to learn more about these practices, to go ahead and check out those reports. So the first one is the National Autism Center, and they published the National Standards Project first in 2009 and then most recently in 2015. And I believe they're currently working on their 3rd review, which is supposed to be released next year. And these reports, this review spans all ages. So they also included interventions that are effective for adulthood. And most recently in the 2015 report, they identified 14 established interventions that have enough evidence to promote effectiveness. And then there is the National Professional Development Center for ASD, and they have also published 2 reports, one in 2008 and then most recently in 2014. And in the 2014 review, they identified 27 evidence-based practices. And additionally, the NPDC developed the training modules that are really helpful. They're called the Affirm Modules. And Janice will talk a little bit more about those at the end. And then lastly, the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice is a continuation of the NPDC, and they just released a report in April of this year. So this is the most recent report there is on evidence-based practices. And their review focuses on ages 0 to 22. And looks at the literature between 1990 and 2017, so fairly recent literature. And they identified 28 evidence-based practices. So just to give you an idea of how extensive and rigorous these scientific reviews are, this most recent report from the NCAPE screened more than 31,000 scientific articles, which is really great, right? Because that means there's a lot of research that's being done on autism. And then based off of their criteria, which we'll go over in a little bit, they ultimately included 634 studies in their review. So for this webinar, we are going to focus on looking at the evidence-based practices that are in this report. But if you aren't interested, again, you can check out each of these reports. And also in the NCAPE report, there's a great table that shows you the overlap between the practices that are listed here and the practices that are listed by the National Autism Center. So really great information for you to delve into if you want to learn more. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about qualifying criteria. So this is really what tells us what makes an intervention evidence-based. So this is the qualifying criteria that was used by the NCAPE. The NCAPE is, again, the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. And so their criteria included both group design and single case design studies. So I'm going to break that down a little bit just so that we can get a better understanding of what that means. Group design studies are those that typically include a group that is receiving the intervention or practice and one group that is not receiving the intervention or practice. And that allows you to compare the two groups to assess the effectiveness of the intervention. And then in single case design studies, you're typically looking at one or maybe a few individuals, and you're examining the effects of the intervention on each individual themselves. And so that sort of explains why there's a difference in the number of group design studies that were needed to qualify and the number of single case design studies to qualify as an evidence-based practice. So again, for each practice, in order to be considered evidence-based, they needed to have at least 2 group design studies or 5 single case design studies, or they could have a combination of 3 single case design studies and 1 group design study. So that's how they determined whether a practice was evidence-based or not. So as you see, there is quite stringent criteria to be considered evidence-based. So before we actually jump in and I show you the 28 evidence-based practices, the NCAPE report also lists commonly recommended practices that as of now do not have sufficient evidence to be considered an EBP. And there's also a couple noted here: auditory integration training and sensory diet, that have conflicting evidence. So it's a little inconclusive whether they can be considered evidence-based. And so really these practices that we see here, we can't use reliably to improve outcomes for individuals with autism. And so again, we encourage you to look at those interventions and practices that are evidence-based to target your specific goal or behavior. And again, this isn't to say that some of these won't eventually become evidence-based practices, but there's just not enough research as of now for them to be considered one. So here are the 28 evidence-based practices identified by the NCAPE report. Of course, we won't be able to go into detail about any of these practices during this webinar. This is more of an overview. But it's really great to see that we have so many interventions that we can choose from, and that research has proven that they can be effective for specific ages and for goal areas. Some of these are probably familiar to you, like reinforcement or visual supports, or modeling, while others might be very new to you as well. One of the things that I did want to note is that many of these can be used together, right? So you might be using reinforcement with visual supports at the same time. And another thing to note is that many of you might provide or receive ABA services, applied behavior analysis. And applied behavior analysis is really a foundation for many of these behavioral interventions like discrete trial training or like naturalistic intervention. So just because a practice maybe that you use isn't on here doesn't necessarily mean that it's not evidence-based. It might be part of one of these categories or practices. And that's also the case for some manualized interventions that have been folded into some of these categories. So some of you might be familiar with PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System. That is folded into the augmentative and alternative communication practice or category. And then something like PRT, pivotal response training, that's been folded into naturalistic intervention. And then there's peers. Some of you might know the peers social skills training, and that is folded into social skills training. So you really have to look into the report to learn a little bit more about what each of these practices entails. Oh, and additionally, with this report that came out in 2020, there's 5 new evidence-based practices that have been identified. So, and those include augmentative and alternative communication, behavioral momentum intervention, direct instruction, music mediated intervention, and sensory integration therapy. All right. So if you want to learn a little bit more about each of the EBPs, a little bit more in depth, the NCAPE report also does provide a breakdown of each practice with the definition, the studies that were included for that evidence-based practice, and also the breakdown of ages and outcomes that it's effective for targeting. And you can access that right here. And I think we'll be able to provide the slides afterward. Yes. All right, so we did a really quick overview of what an evidence-based practice is and what they are. But now that we know all about that, how do we actually choose a practice? Well, the NCAPE also developed this matrix that lists all of the evidence-based practices here on the left. This is just a snippet of the entire matrix because we wanted to make sure that you could actually read everything. So there is more goal domains to the left, and of course, the rest of the practices toward the bottom. But essentially, the practices are listed here on the left, and the goal areas are listed up at the top. Right? So if you're looking for a practice that can target challenging behavior, then you would look in this column. And then below the goals, you can see the age ranges that, so you would want to look at the age range that you're interested in. So if you have a 13-year-old and you want to see what practices might be effective in targeting challenging behavior for that 13-year-old, then you would look at the challenging behavior domain, look at the age range 6 to 14 because 13 falls in that range. And then anything that is colored is a practice that could be used to target that goal and that age, right? So the only one it seems like here is DI, which stands for direct instruction. That's the only one that doesn't seem to be effective in targeting that goal and that age at that age range. So I know it looks a little bit intimidating at first, but it really is a useful tool when you're trying to determine what are the possibilities for selecting a practice. So let's take another look. So let's look at this. The other thing to mention is that in this matrix, it only shows you the initials, the acronyms for the practices, but you can look at what these acronyms actually mean in the report. So let's look at ABI, which stands for antecedent-based intervention. And so again, anything that is not colored in means that that practice is not effective for targeting that skill and that age range. So for ABI, it seems like for the cognitive area, it's not effective for any of the age ranges. And that seems to be the case also for joint attention. So now let's have you try. If you can, I think the easiest way would be in the chat. I'm going to give you an area and an age range, and tell me the practices that are effective in targeting that area. So let's look at challenging and interfering behavior. And tell me the practices that are effective in targeting challenging behavior for the age range of 15 to 22. Let's take a minute and you can put it in the chat box. Okay, I'll wait a little bit more. Yep, I'm seeing all of them. I'm seeing ABI, right? That's colored in. I'm seeing CBIS, and that's colored in. And then I'm seeing DR, which is colored in as well. So it seems like you all are understanding how to read the matrix. That's great. All right. So let's move on. And then this tool literally, I think, was just released last week by the NCAPE. And it's called the EBP Database. And it's designed also to help you in EBP selection process. So you can use the matrix, you can also use this database. And I'm gonna actually click on it so that we can look through it together and show you how to use it. Let me see if it'll open. Great. So this is what the EBP database looks like. And what you do is, again, you pick an age. So let's go ahead and pick 3 to 6, right? Yeah, the 3 to 6 age range. And let's pick joint attention as our goal area. And then you're going to go ahead and click apply. And so what this tells you, it'll tell you all of the studies that were included in the review that look at joint attention for this age range. So there was 44 articles, and they're all listed here for you to read more about them if you would like to. And then here on the left, it'll tell you all of the EBPs that can be used for joint attention for the 3 to 6 age range. So if you are specifically interested in parent implemented intervention, then you could click on that, and it'll give you the 8 articles that showed that parent implemented intervention is effective for targeting joint attention for the 3 to 6 age range. So this tool is also more for you to be able to read more about the studies for each of the practices. Go back to here. Great. So now we were going to take maybe like 3 to 5 minutes for you to practice on your own, either using the matrix or the database that I just showed you. You can think of somebody maybe on your caseload, or your child, or whatever you would like. Think of somebody, identify their age, identify what target goal or area you want to work on, and then either using the database or the matrix, identify the EBPs that can be used. Again, you can either put the information in the chat box, or if you would like to talk a little bit, then you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. But let's go ahead and take maybe like 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes to do this.
And can we put the link back in the chat at the bottom, just because I know that it's moved upwards since.
Yeah, let's see. So here's the matrix. And then Janice just posted the database.
It's a quiet group.
I was giving them a couple more minutes, but if anybody's ready to share, you can, or if you have questions about how to use the tools, you feel free to unmute yourselves and share, or put your questions in the chat box as well. All right, would anyone like to share? Or let me know if you need a couple more minutes. Oh, there you go, a couple in the chat.
Nope, just
Oh.
Okay, I did adjust the age, 36 months to 3.5 years, I guess.
Mhm.
And I did communication.
Okay.
It came like all the things like the PACs, social stories, DTT, like there's, I guess, 193.
Articles.
Yes.
Yes, great. And does it, how many EBPs are listed on the left?
On the left, let me just see, because I have to maximize my screen. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Wow, a lot.
15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22.
Wow, that's
24,
almost
Yeah.
all of them.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and I would say that for communication and behavior, those are probably the two that have the most practices that are helpful in using, for sure. Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
And we have a couple too in the chat. Vanessa says, I'm thinking a student I work with, he's 8 years old and a behavioral target. And so you can use differential reinforcement for that. That's great. Yeah, and I think you're probably using the shortened matrix on the slide, but there's probably some other EBPs that can be used as well. And then we have Billie Jean. My daughter's 2, has not been placed on the spectrum, but I've seen some challenging behavior with communication. By using the matrix, I found that using naturalistic intervention would be helpful. definitely. And there's a lot of different practices that fall under naturalistic intervention. And I would say like those are probably often used in ABA services as well. Yeah. Anyone have any other questions or would like to share? It doesn't seem like it. So should we go ahead and pivot?
Or does anyone have questions on any of the content that was discussed?
Yeah.
Another thing I want to clarify too is that just because we don't see it on the EBP matrix doesn't mean that it won't eventually become an evidence-based practice. I'm not sure, I'm sorry if I missed that, Melina, if you did mention that, but as was highlighted by those red squares that you saw on the list of 28 evidence-based practices, those were all new that were identified in the last year. And those were once, some of those were once on the list of things that were not evidence-based. So that's something to keep in mind, is that just because we don't see evidence for it doesn't mean that more won't come, or just because the matrix shows that it's a white square and it's not colored in doesn't mean that it will never become an evidence-based practice for that particular age range or that particular skill. It just means there hasn't been enough. It goes back to that qualifying criteria, right? There just hasn't been enough research been done on it yet for us to say with a great deal of confidence, yes, this is going to be effective for that age of a child and that particular skill that you want to be working on.
And that's particularly the case like for something like sensory integration therapy, which for a long time was not considered evidence-based, but a lot of people use. And then this year it is now officially an evidence-based practice. And same thing with music-mediated interventions.
We have a question from Vanessa. For cognitive, there is not that many EBPAs. Is it because the brain is always developing? I am looking at the matrix.
That's a good question. I don't know, Janice. I don't know if it's a matter of, again, the NCAPE report looks mostly at focused practices. And so they are not really looking at comprehensive packages, comprehensive intervention packages. So that could be a case of maybe it's specific packages that weren't included in this report that target mental health or cognitive areas. That could be one of the reasons.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think that's a really great question. I don't know what I'm actually not sure what they consider cognitive, because academic is a column as well.
Yeah.
And then behavior, like challenging behavior, is a column. Maybe they mean like executive functioning type stuff. Do you think?
It could be, yeah.
And so in that case, like cognitive behavioral interventions, which is, I think, CBIS, according to the new matrix, is on there. And that's an evidence-based practice for executive functioning.
It could also be, like you said, that there's just not enough research done in that area. I think especially for autism, a lot of the research for evidence-based practices is around behavior and communication. So it could be that, again, there's not a lot of research in that area.
Anyone else have any questions?
How long does it take a study to complete? The systematic review, so each study is its own individual study, and there's varying factors on how long it takes, but the systematic reviews that compile all of the articles together and determine which ones fit the qualifying criteria, those take years. So from 2014 to 2020, they were basically working on this newest report that came out.
Yeah, and studies do range. It just depends on the type of study, how many participants you're trying to test, whether COVID happens in the middle of your study and you have to pause it. There's just a lot of factors. And so it really varies depending on what kind of study. Obviously, if you only have one participant or just a few participants, it's going to be much faster than a group study that includes maybe 100 students or something like that. So like recently, I just finished a project where we were all across the state of California in Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego. And we had I think we had about 100 students every school year times 3 school years. So the study itself is now in its 4th year. And then, there's 4 years worth of data in which to analyze and write a report or a paper. So it can be a very long process from the point of the start of the study to the point where it shows up on one of these resources.
Right. Any other questions before we pivot? Okay, doesn't seem like it. So like I said, this is sort of the first step in being able to identify and select an evidence-based practice. Now we are going to pivot, and Janice is going to talk a little bit about how you can learn more about the practices, and then and also share about some local organizations as well. And you can ask us more questions if you didn't get to. You can ask us more questions at the end. Okay. All right.
Okay, great. So I'm really excited about this section. I think, it's great to be able to, it's a great tool to be able to identify evidence-based practices. But what's even more like an extra step is to be able to access them, right? Like, how do I get more information about how to use these practices? And how might I be able to receive these services or these practices? So the first one we wanted to introduce is the Affirm modules, and Melina did refer back to this or refer to this back in the beginning of this presentation. And the Affirm modules are a really great free resource that are available from the UNC, University of North Carolina. They created these online tutorials, kind of like it's an interactive tutorial about each of those evidence-based practices. So let's just say you were curious about how to accurately use prompting, or there was a certain kind of prompt hierarchy that you were curious about learning more in detail. They will, this online resource will go through each one of those, types of prompting hierarchies, explain to you the difference of them. You can even get a certificate to show that you took this online course about prompting. And so that just provides a lot of great information. And like I said, it's free. So they go through most of those evidence-based practices. I think some of the newer ones they may not have up yet. And so I would really recommend looking into those if you're curious about learning more about how to implement each of these practices. They even have checklists of how you're supposed to be using them, which is really great to make sure that you're using them correctly, because the whole idea behind evidence-based practices is that, all of these research articles are saying these are evidence-based practices because, everybody's been using it similarly. But if you change a little bit of the practice, it might not be as effective, right? If I decide to take something out because I don't feel like doing it, or it's too hard for me to implement a certain piece of that practice, then I don't actually know how effective it is. That's kind of the conversation of fidelity to intervention. And so we want to make sure we're using it the way research intends for it to be used. And so modules like the Affirm modules help us to understand and make sure that we're all using it correctly.
if you don't mind if I jump in to Janice, you can also actually download like an entire package that also has like data collection sheets that you can also use, and like tips for professionals, tips for parents. So it's just such a great resource for anybody to use to learn more about evidence-based practices.
Yeah, and it looks like those of you who are joining us from Canada have used this before, which is great. And, you know, even in our classes here in San Diego, we actually, in our class, we require our students to do one of the modules and present one of the certificates as an assignment. Yeah. So it's a really great tool that's available. Okay, so then the next one is really cool from UC Davis. It's the Adept Modules. And these were created very recently in response to this shift to distance learning that has happened. I don't know if that's the case in Canada quite as much as it is here, but a lot of our schools here in San Diego are continuing to be closed. And that has put a lot of strain on parents, right? It's parents that have been able to bring their kids with autism to school, and thus they don't know any of the practices that are relevant. They don't know how to be homeschooling their kids while the schools are closed. And so these interactive modules, learning modules, they're self-paced and they're all available online for free, help to provide for parents some tools and training so that they can teach their kids with autism or other developmental disorders at home using some ABA techniques. So they get, I believe if I remember correctly, they get pretty practical, you know, things like hook up your computer to the big TV in your living room so that your TV and the teacher is a more salient cue to your student or your child. So that is another really great resource that's available for free that can connect you to evidence-based practices and how to use them.
The other great thing about those, the Adept modules, is that they are available in Spanish, and also a couple other languages, I think Vietnamese, and I think it might be like Cantonese and Mandarin. I'm not entirely sure, but they're available in a few different languages.
That's great. Wider access is always appreciated. Yes. Okay, so CISA is this Center for Secondary Education for students with autism spectrum disorders. And it was a project it's a large scale research study that was conducted across 60 high schools in different regions of the US. So we did have some sites here in San Diego, and it focused on developing and adapting a comprehensive school program and community-based program for high schoolers with autism. And their goal in doing so was to create some resources that could be available to individuals with autism themselves, as well as resources for families. So this is an example, a screenshot I took of one of their newsletters that is written for families about how to facilitate skills at home. And then if you click again, Melina, there's some about geared towards professionals. So this is a planning document to help a teacher identify what EBPs they might use for what domains they're going to be teaching. And then if you click it again, another resource that's available, that these were actually created by Teens for Autism for Teens for Autism. And this particular one is a newsletter article about how to prepare for a transition to adulthood. So these are just a small sampling of some of the many resources that are available in this resource bank that if you go to that link that Melina provided, yet you can be able to access those for free. Next, that was about high schoolers. And so now we shift to the little ones with the ASD Toddler Initiative, again, out of the UNC, the group in UNC. And this, in addition to providing information about how to use evidence-based practices for toddlers with autism, they also aim to help provide information and training about early identification of autism. And that's really important because we need to equip parents and professionals alike to be able to see autism earlier so that we can catch it earlier and intervene earlier, right? The earlier we can identify somebody with autism, the earlier we can start giving them access to treatment that can help with some of these core symptoms. And next we have Captain, which Melina is personally more involved in, but it's the California Autism Professional Training and Information Network. I'm realizing we didn't put the URL to the Captain website here, but it's captain.ca.gov. It's a really cool network of professionals in the field of autism, particularly like schools and SELPAs, as well as family resource centers. And one of the great resources that they developed is this Padlet of different resources to support school closures and this shift to distance learning for students with autism. So, and the great thing is a lot of these resources are available in Spanish as well, as screenshotted here on this slide. But they have like different apps and things that are helpful for people with autism, different resources for parents, as well as some social stories written to explain COVID to students with autism.
And I might have missed it, but the Padlet is available in Spanish as well. I don't know if you mentioned that, Janice.
Oh, I think I did.
Oh, sorry.
Do you mind actually linking the Padlets
yes.
in the chat?
I'll do that, yeah. Let me go to the next one.
Okay, so another really great way to access EBPs for autism for free is to be able to participate in research projects. And actually here, for those of you here in San Diego, we are a little bit of like a hotbed of autism research. There's just so much going on. This doesn't even, I mean, this is only what we could come up with off the top of our heads, but if we did more research and we expanded to other types of autism related research, we could be talking for a whole nother workshop about the types of research opportunities that you can get involved in. So Melina, since your name is the contact on this Captain Disparities grant, I'd love for you to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a grant that is funded by the Department of Developmental Services here in California. And the goal of the grant is to reduce disparities in autism services, specifically at the regional center level. And so we were awarded this grant, and so we're working on it right now. And the goal of it is to translate a lot of those Captain resources that you can find on the Captain website. We have everything from presentations on what is autism, presentations on many EBPs individually, a lot of different resources that we have. And some of them are available in Spanish, but really we want to expand. And so the goal of the grant is to be able to translate a lot of those resources into different languages for families and other stakeholders. And so the first step of that grant is for us to conduct focus groups with these target linguistic groups so that we can understand what the needs of these communities are. And so right now we are recruiting Tagalog, Arabic, and Vietnamese speaking family members and stakeholders to participate in a 1-hour focus group. There is a $50 incentive as well. So if you are somebody that fits into one of these categories, or if you know of people that would be interested, please contact me. We really are really looking to to include about 6 people from each of these groups in a focus group. So again, if you know of anybody or if you yourself are interested, please contact me at that email address.
And Melina, do they need to be ASD families affected by ASD? Okay.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, that's not in the description, but yes, this is specifically because Captain specifically works with the autism population and about evidence-based practices for autism. We are looking for people that either have a child or work with children that have autism.
Great. And then 2 other research studies from our colleagues at San Diego State. One is Project Impact, which is an early intervention related evidence-based practice. It falls under the category of naturalistic interventions on the matrix. But they're looking for therapists and agencies to participate in their study to receive training in Project Impact, and they're specifically recruiting at the agency level. So if you are an early intervention therapist, I believe that you need to be recruited at your agency level, like not just a single therapist, but your entire agency needs to participate, is my understanding of their recruitment process. And so if that fits your qualifications, then go ahead and contact Marissa there. Her address is there. And then also our friend and colleague, Dr. Kelsey Dixon, who is also involved here at the SDSU Autism Center, is conducting a study looking at using, what is it called, Melina?
Unstuck and on target.
Yeah, Unstuck and on target. And she is looking for caregivers of children with autism who have experience with mental health services. So mental health services doesn't mean ABA. It refers to the therapies that are accessed because of other sorts of mental health diagnoses like ADHD, anxiety, depression. And so they're looking for these caregivers to complete surveys, and you would receive compensation in the form of an Amazon gift card. And then there may be a chance to participate further in an interview process, which is also compensated. Okay, so another evidence-based practice that that we wanted to share about how you can access this in the community. And I'm sorry for those of you in Canada. We were totally expecting that only San Diego residents would be on this call. So I'm sorry that we don't have any local resources available for those of you in Canada. But for those of you here in San Diego, if you're interested in learning more or having free access to alternative and augmentative communication, which is one of those evidence-based practices on the matrix or in that EBP report, we actually have this United Cerebral Palsy Assistive Technology Center. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure, and I couldn't find any information on their website regarding whether they're open during COVID. But what they do have is a lending library and open labs where you can kind of play around and even borrow and take home some of the assistive technology. So let's just say you wanted to try out some sort of a voice output device for your child. You could go to this UCP lab and borrow or attend a training about how you might, what kinds of voice output devices might be appropriate for your child, the things to consider about choosing a voice output. You know, all these kinds of resources are actually available for free. So you can check out their website to get their contact information and reach out to them individually if you are interested in learning more. I think some of our classes at San Diego State, when they are in session in person, actually go to this Assistive Technology Center and visit and get to play around. So it's a really cool experience. Another opportunity to access EBP for free is one of the EBPs is exercise and movement. particularly helpful for the area of challenging behaviors. But our center here, this SDSU Center for Autism, actually does virtual yoga, and their yoga is actually listed as one of the exercise and movement like categories in that might be considered as one of these evidence-based practices. So actually this coming Sunday, right, Vinton, we have a yoga class virtually coming up. And so we have the registration link, but Vinton, if you would like to provide a flyer or your link to your Eventbrite or whatever, that feel free to do that in the chat box.
Yeah, I'll send that right now.
Okay, great. And so it's this Sunday at 11 a.m. And then finally, the last one I wanted to point out is music mediated interventions. Now, again, this is considered a new evidence-based practice, just recently having enough evidence to be put on this list. But we do here locally have a few nonprofit organizations that provide access to music therapy for free. Banding Together is one that provides specific to children with special needs. Others kind of focus on other people groups like veterans or neonatal type music therapy, but this one in particular provides virtual music therapy groups for individuals with disabilities. They have groups ranging from 3 to 5 years old as their youngest, all the way up to teens and young adults. And then they also raise money to provide music therapy scholarships for individual music therapy sessions.
Great. Oh, that's it.
Yeah, so that is our sampling. Of course, I'm sure there's other ways in our community where you can access EBPs for free or reduced cost, but we just wanted to provide a little sampling of ways that you can get access to some of these and get connected to some of these evidence-based practices for autism.
We can open it up now for questions or discussion that people would like to have. We provided our contact information here. You can always reach out to us too if you have specific questions, or if you would like advice on us pointing you maybe to services or something of the sort. You can email us as well. But does anyone have any questions about what was presented today?
Come on, folks, don't be shy. We have a question from Billie Jean, I believe. As a student, I am so thankful for all of you've shared. I feel like this will be very helpful in the field. I really appreciate it and enjoy it. Not a question, but thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
We have a question from Pat. Would eating disorders qualify in adaptive or self-help? And also as food repertoire expansion program or feeding therapy and EBP?
As far as I know, a food repertoire expansion program or feeding therapy is not one of the listed EBPs. I would check out the NCAPE report to see if there's any literature that, like, if it's maybe on like the emerging evidence or if they discuss it at all. I would double check the NCAPE, but I think as of right now, it's not on the EBP list. And then in terms of eating disorders qualifying in adaptive or self-help, again, I think the report also gives a definition and explanation of each of those outcome areas. So I would again refer to the NCAPE report to see what exactly they qualify as adaptive or self-help skills.
I think that generally eating disorders tend not to be considered like an area specific for autism. I think that the EBPs listed there tend to be for skill areas that are specifically areas that people with autism struggle with. So they would probably say rely on then other domains or other professionals,
Like
for example,
behavior.
a psychologist who might specialize in the treatment of eating disorders, and they might use some of the practices that fall under the matrix. For example, a shaping procedure might fall under one of those categories, which is something that people might use in order, I think feeding therapists and eating disorder therapists might actually use some of the practices that are looped in or included in one of those other categories.
And that's actually like a good point too, Janice, because a lot of the things that what we say to people when we're presenting about EBPs for autism is that these are great practices for any child or for any student. They aren't necessarily practices that can only be used for autism. Reinforcement should be used for all students, right? So that's a good point also, is that these practices are really beneficial for most individuals.
Yeah, and also just that I don't think it includes all the potential skills just because a person, right? Just because a person with autism has a particular issue with eating or, whatever it is, it might be that you have to kind of rely on the expertise of another type of professional, like an occupational therapist, in order to engage in those behaviors more effectively. Sorry, Vinton, did I cut you off?
Oh, no, I was just gonna see if anyone else had any questions. And you're welcome to unmute yourselves if you prefer to ask instead of type. All right, going once, going twice. Anybody?
Oh, stop sharing.
All right, well, thank you so much, Janice, Melina. That's a really fascinating topic. I'm sure everyone in the audience could see. So folks, we are at the end of, this is our last workshop of the year. As Janice said, we'll be having a activity, the yoga and mindfulness virtual class on Sunday. So if you're interested, if there's a teen in your life on the spectrum who would be interested, they're more than welcome to sign up. And we will, this is being recorded, so we'll post this on our Center for Autism YouTube channel, and we will email everybody with the links to resources, to the PDF for the PowerPoint, and to all of the resources and whatnot. So you'll be getting an email from me either tomorrow or on Monday. So, so thank you so much, everybody, and virtual applause speakers.
Thank you,
everyone.
Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.